going to do a bit of a walk through the numbers from a political and economic situation. And so you have to kind of think of this as the intersection of sentiment and economic outcomes, sentiment and potentially political outcomes. And I'm going to share with you the latest tracking that was actually completed last night at around 9 or 10 o'clock. We're going to do a walk through the trends. I'm actually going to show, it was kind of funny, I was talking to Dave earlier when he was saying that everything is live streamed. I'm actually going to be, you're going to be the first to see our, some of our seat projections, which we have not shared anywhere, but just happened to be in the slide deck. Thanks, Dave, for the live feed. But we're going to show you where we think the political environment is now based on the latest modeling that we've just done over the holiday weekend. So before we get into the political front, what I'd like to do is just put a little bit of a spotlight on the Bloomberg Nanos Canadian Confidence Index. We've been tracking now for about 10 years. What's interesting about the index is that it's streamed on a weekly basis for Bloomberg subscribers at 10 o'clock every Monday. And what you may or may not know is that when we crunch out the numbers, it's about a 90-day predictor of GDP over about a 624-month cycle. So it gives us a fairly good understanding of where things are going. Here's a little piece of trivia. Over the 624 months of tracking on sentiment and its alignment with GDP, there are actually 3 months out of the 624 cycles where Canadian sentiment does not align with where GDP goes. Any guesses on where that might be? During elections. Believe it or not, we've statistically crunched the numbers, and in the 4 weeks in the 2008, 2010, and 2015 election, for the 4 weeks, the correlations that exist become inverse correlations. It's kind of like people do not become rational during a 4-week period, and they lose their sense of the value of real estate. They lose their sense of their personal security in terms of their job. They lose their sense in terms of their personal finances. So I'm going to be showing you kind of the latest numbers. So the red line are expectations, where people think things are going to go in the next 6 months, the forward-looking expectations index. The blue trend line is the pocketbook index. And what you can see, this is a diffusion index, which means any score greater than 50 is net positive. Anything below 50 is net negative. Anything at 50 is neutral. And what you can see, at least for a good part of the first part of the year, we were effectively, at least from a consumer confidence point of view, on the forward look, sputtering into neutral, which kind of explains the GDP numbers, which have been relatively flat. So we see a bit of an increase in July, and that will kind of correlate to the last quarter. And big surprise, we can see consumer confidence, for some reason, always rises during elections. Maybe that's because they think that there are goodies that they're going to benefit from, all the wonderful things that politicians have promised will happen if they happen to be elected or selected by voters. But the key takeaway here is that, similar to kind of what I'll say the quant economists that we've heard, we kind of see, at least in the Bloomberg Nanos Confidence Index, more of a sputtering of consumer confidence and probably a sputtering of the GDP, at least based on the trend that we see. So let's take a moment to talk about the election. So once this was an interesting slide, now it's ironic, perhaps, for those of you that have been following Canadian politics. You know in 2015, Justin Trudeau won a majority government. Actually, for those of you following the Canadian election, his majority was actually only won in the last 5 days of the campaign. About 7 to 10 days out, he was actually winning, but only a minority government. And for the first 3 years of the Liberal mandate, it was quite clear that it was an exceptional honeymoon. But for those of you that might or might not be observers of Canadian politics, two caveats, not little, significant caveats that I'd put on the table, is that during that 2 to 3 year honeymoon, for most of that, there was no permanent leader of the Conservative Party, and there was no permanent leader of the New Democrats. So big surprise that the Liberals enjoyed an exceptionally long period, at least of positive numbers, but the reality is that was a Potemkin village because there were no alternatives, as the other two opposition parties were trying to sort through their leadership. And when we're looking at this particular election, the other thing that's clear is that, even going in the week before the election was called, the Liberals had, you can see, a marginal advantage over the Conservatives. But that now you can see, I call it dueling trend lines, the she loves me not trend lines. I call it the spaghetti trend lines. It's been a tie so many times that every day I'm kind of at a loss to figure out a new way. I think today I refer to it as the coin toss election. But the reality is that what we've seen is that right now, neither of the front-running parties has enough support to form any type of majority government on their own. And the reality is that the numbers for one of the parties has to hit above 35 or 36 for someone to careen closer to forming a majority government. Quick walk through the trends of the campaign. Very first day of the campaign, when the writ was issued at Rideau Hall, and Justin Trudeau was kind of having his first press conference, he was on the defensive. He was on the defensive because of the SNC-Lavalin story in the Globe and Mail, the national newspaper that day. Also on the defensive on controversial Bill 21 in Quebec, which was the religious symbols ban. If you were watching that particular press conference, all the Quebec reporters were asking Justin Trudeau whether he would launch a legal challenge. He was a bit cagey that day. But the other thing that happened that day was Andrew Scheer basically came out very strong and swinging, saying that Justin Trudeau was a liar. It's kind of like first sentence of the first day of the first minute of the campaign for the Conservatives, and then they kind of went into what I'll say the Conservative attack ads, which include kind of not as advertised. And many times I'm asked, do negative attack ads work? And I always say the exact same thing. I say yes if they're good, but B, they also need validation either from a third party or the target. In this particular case, those ads from the Conservatives were good. They were validated by the third party, Globe and Mail, on the first day of the campaign. Then they were validated by the target with the now famous blackface, brownface controversy of photographs from 19 years ago of Justin Trudeau. And this is the period you can see around the latter part of September where the Conservatives actually pull about 5 points ahead. The other interesting thing when we look at the demographics is that there was a significant, what I'll say, almost like repulsion among millennial voters when they saw the blackface pictures. That for a cohort that was very enthusiastic about the Liberals, liked Justin Trudeau, liked the positive demeanor, liked the platform and the direction, they saw these pictures, and you have to remember for these millennials, they make their judgments based on today and their own personal livelihood, their own personal place, that this was a bit of a disconnect. And actually, this was one of the moments where millennials started to shake loose for the Liberals, and they started to look at Jagmeet Singh, the leader of the New Democrat, which is a social democrat party, look at him as an alternative to Justin Trudeau. And, not without kind of any exception, but Andrew Scheer had his own problem during the campaign. And his problems related to clarification about his accreditation as an insurance broker, clarification about what university he graduated in, because in some places he had reported graduating from one particular university, but he had only taken an online course there and transferred that course to another university. And also questions related to, and the Liberals have been using this to try to define Andrew Scheer, questions related to abortion and same-sex marriage. And he had his bad week, and this is where the Liberals kind of came back on top for a little bit more. But I think if you were to kind of sum up the campaign, the reality is that we're talking about a campaign of imperfect choices. And in these imperfect choices, the none of the above candidate has, I think for all intents and purposes, become Jagmeet Singh and the New Democrats. That his personal positive numbers were up 14 points since the beginning of the campaign. He had a good debate, good couple debates, good 3 debates, and his numbers started to move going into the holiday weekend. Now, you can see there's no chance of him winning. The reality is at 19%, it's a fairly good showing, but it's still going to be a significant setback for the New Democrats come the next federal election, come Monday. The other big question are vote splits. So right now, the NDP picking up support is good news for the Conservatives, although for it to have a material impact on the number of seats, that number has to cycle up into the 20s. And if the NDP in the next 3 to 4 days cycle into the 20s, you will see a significant change in the potential outcome of the election where these close ridings will kind of tip in favor of the Conservatives as the progressive vote changes. And to make things even more kind of complicated, that there's not only the deadlock in the ballot numbers, there's a complete deadlock in terms of who Canadians would prefer as Prime Minister. And you can see the trend line, the gray line is the trajectory of undecided voters. And you can see for all intents and purposes that Jagmeet Singh has not necessarily converted Andrew Scheer people or Justin Trudeau people into the column. He's basically become more attractive for voters that were undecided and weren't necessarily happy with either of the two front-running parties. And you know, in this kind of indecision that we're at, should we really be surprised? Have we talked about issues? Yeah, you notice crickets? Yeah, no. The campaign has not effectively focused on issues like a lot of other campaigns. And you know, when we ask Canadians what their top unprompted national issue of concern is, you can see at the very top, and they can say whatever they want, the environment, jobs and the economy, healthcare, at the very top of the grid in this unprompted question. And you know, many times I'm asked this environment number they see, and you know, the environment is the top national issue of concern. Here's another little tidbit. In 30 years of tracking, jobs in the economy or healthcare have been the top unprompted national issues of concern, except in the last 6 months. That's 30 years of polling. Why has that happened? It's not just because Canadians are concerned about global warming and climate change. Actually, what's interesting now is an increasing number of Canadians are identifying the environment as an issue because whenever they hear the environment, they're thinking about pipelines. They're thinking about carbon taxes. They're thinking about resource development. So now the environment is morphing into an issue that's not just about the future of climate change and global warming. It's turning into a battleground issue that is connecting to jobs and the economy, the structure of jobs, where jobs are going to come from, how are we going to have prosperity, how do we reconcile our environmental aspirations with economic prosperity. So don't think that Canadians are more likely to become tree huggers in the last 6 months. That's not the case. They've actually kind of connected the environment to the economy, and it's become a key battleground issue. So as I was saying, we've statistically modeled, so this was Nik's little project. For the last year, we statistically modeled 73,000 polling stations. A polling station is where people vote. And we're doing projections on 73,000 neighborhoods now every week, and then we build our model up from a polling station or neighborhood of 300 voters into one of the 338 ridings into the country. And you're actually the first to see this, so for any of you that's streaming this, you might want to take notes. But we'll be kind of releasing something like this on the eve of the election and on election day. And what we have here is if a riding is assigned a particular party color, that means that that riding we have declared a winner by 7% or more. If it is black, it means that riding is too close to call, 2% or less. If it is gray, the riding has a margin between 2 and 7%, so we still consider that too close to call. As we do a quick whip through the country, in Atlantic Canada, where the Liberals swept all of the seats, they will lose seats. That blue box is New Brunswick. They'll lose a number of seats to the Conservatives. Quebec, we'll be seeing the Bloc pick up seats in Quebec, perhaps 20 seats, depending on our modeling. In Ontario, the Liberals are still doing well, but watch the 905 because the Conservatives need to do better in the 905 in order to do well in the election. West, you can see the prairies, a big blue block. British Columbia. Is anyone here from British Columbia? Well, if you are, you will be able to torment everyone because usually British Columbians are upset because they're on the Pacific coast. The election's usually done by the time we get to their returns coming in, but there are a number of ridings that are up for grabs. So this is another chart that no one has seen, except the folks inside the firm. So what we do is you can see we have 27 of the 338 ridings that are within 2%, another 68 that are 2 to 7%, which makes 95 ridings that are too close to call out of 338. The other thing that you'll notice, and this is kind of the week-by-week modeling, the other thing you'll notice, the Liberal support is more efficient at generating seats than the Conservatives. Okay, last slide. I'm going to whip through this fast because we're going to go to questions. What you need to know about the Canadian election. First of all, today, no majority. Second of all, in terms of a potential outcome, we may have an election where the Conservatives win the popular vote by 2%, but actually lose in terms of forming a government. They could win fewer seats, and the Liberals will form the government. Does that sound familiar? Someone winning the popular vote by 2% and someone else winning the real kind of vote? So put that, kind of chew on that in terms of a potential outcome where the race is so close that there will be many Canadians that will be upset with the outcome. And I guess the last thing to say is we finished polling on Sunday night. So if you want to find out who wins the election, Dave has my email address. Send an email to Dave Scanlan, and Dave will connect us for you to get what our latest numbers are that we'll be pushing out. So I think with that, I'm going to sit down, and then Dave, we're going to have a chat.
Don't send me too many emails, but I'll take a couple. Thanks, Nik. That was fascinating stuff. And I want to start with the poll projections because, as you say, popular support is nice, but it doesn't really matter, right? We saw it in the U.S. in 2016, and we may see it here again in Canada. I'm struck by the gap. And I realize there's a lot of undecided voters there, but your numbers are showing 127 projected to win for the Liberals, 84 for the Tories. I look at the CBC poll tracker, which includes your numbers and others, much, much closer, 135 to 132. So can you just explain why the gap there?
Well, the thing is that for the Conservatives, they're in a lot more of these tighter races. So then kind of when we convert it out, it is a little closer. But, you know, the reality is that in the prairie provinces, which represent about 25% of the total sample, the Conservatives have these margins of 20 and 30%. So you look at the national number and it looks close. But if you took the prairies out of the equation, the Liberals are actually much more competitive right now, and that's what counts for the difference, at least in the way we're building our model, because we're building it up from the neighborhood up.
Right, right. And so, what's the sort of keys to victory for both? What does Trudeau need to do? What has to happen for him to at least be in a position to form a minority government?
Well, he has to do well in the province of Quebec. The Bloc Numbers, which is the separatist party, has been very successful in this election. Although they haven't been talking as much about separatism, they've been talking about nationalism. Stuff like, we're not going to have the federal government interfere in the affairs of the province. And also advancing that if there is a minority government, that the Bloc Québécois will spend their time effectively lobbying and getting as much out of the federal government and the federation as possible. And, you know, they've got an easy job. There's no platform, no costing, no budget, no anything, because there's no expectation that they'll ever form a government. And they don't really have a lot of promises other than to say, well, we're going to put our hand out, right? We're going to try to get as much as we can out of the federation. So for Trudeau, he's got to fight off the Bloc in the province of Quebec. Vancouver's going to be interesting because Vancouver's an interesting city because we have the Greens. They could win between 3 and 5 seats, mostly on the island of Vancouver. But British Columbia is open now. I call it an open province where it's basically a 3.5-way race. And with these vote splits, it's hard to really predict what could happen in BC.
And the big question in everyone's mind is, okay, it's a minority, who's going to hook up with who? Do you see any issues with Trudeau and the NDP, for example? Do you think that is a likely outcome and doable?
Well, it's the most likely one because it's been telegraphed by Jagmeet Singh, the new Democrat leader. But the other thing is in the Westminster system, the Conservatives could win the greatest number of seats, like one more seat than Justin Trudeau, but the sitting prime minister will be asked to form a government first, right? And the reality is that he's got more, you know, I think the day after the election, this could be kind of like, I don't you remember those awkward high school dances where people are sometimes establishing eye contact or not? with potential dance partners. That's what this House of Commons could be like, right? Because at some point, for potential partners with the government, the next government, there'll obviously be some sort of conditions. It could be related to pipeline development. It could be related to democratic renewal. It could be related to a carbon tax. And this is where it becomes much more problematic.
Yeah. I'm expecting a lot of chaos on the night of, by the way, because I think a lot of people are not aware of what you just said, which is that everyone is going to assume that Tories have the most seats, therefore they can form the government.
Yeah.
Not necessarily.
Yeah, if you're trading on volatility, so think of it this way: we could have a trend line where the Conservatives have a 1 percentage point advantage, like they do today, and the Conservatives win one more seat, and the Liberals form a government. And Canadians are not parliamentary experts. And the whole idea, there will be people that will say, how can we take losers, people that lost the popular vote, even if by a close margin,
and the seat tally, in fact.
And the seat tally, say by 1 or 2, how can we take winners and make them losers, and take losers and make them winners? And you can imagine if you're in the West and this happens, you're going to blow a gasket, right? Because in the first place, you can't even fathom how anyone would vote for the Liberals, because everyone is voting. Everyone, or most everyone, is voting for the Conservatives in provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan.
Let's turn to the Tories now. What's the key to victory for Andrew Scheer and his party, and what does the coalition or some kind of a loose arrangement look like for them?
Well, I think for Andrew Scheer, his game has to be basically in the 905 is a ring of ridings, suburban ridings outside of Toronto. It's Battleground 905 and also British Columbia. In the 905, the Conservatives cannot form a government unless they do well in the 905. So I would expect Andrew Scheer to go hard into the 905. His affordability, these housing platforms are 905 strategies where housing is unaffordable for a lot of young families, and politicians are trying to connect with those voters in order to motivate them. So for Andrew Scheer, watch him go into the 905, but also watch him go into British Columbia. And to put this into context, with the rise of the Greens in British Columbia and the New Democrats, there's a conceivable outcome where the Conservatives get the same popular support as they did in 2015, but win a boatload of more ridings because, on the progressive side of the ledger in British Columbia, you've got the Liberals, you've got the New Democrats, you've got the Greens, right? So the progressive vote is effectively split 3 ways, while the center-right vote is just with the Tories.
And if we get into minority, who can the Tories work with? Scheer's
Well,
already said this week, I'm not going to work with the Bloc, so
yeah, it's kind
who's
of like,
left?
well, the thing is that for both of the front runners, it's kind of like, I don't know, I don't want to date myself. It's kind of like Sergeant Schultz from Hogan's Heroes. Like, I know nothing. They don't want to talk about, they don't want to talk about a potential minority because it's an admission of defeat, and it's an admission of weakness if the 2 front runners start talking about a minority government. But for Andrew Scheer, his tricky part is that one of the parties, the Bloc Québécois, is, I won't call it a natural, but a possible, not a partner, but a possible group of seats and votes in the House of Commons that could vote with the Conservatives on specific issues. It's just the Conservative base hates that. I think for him, people see the Bloc as a potential alternative. But the Bloc leader, Blanchette, has done a good job in this election. He's been very clear in his messaging. I think he's going to swing wherever he thinks he can make the most for his province. And maybe one thing that the Bloc and Andrew Scheer and the Conservatives can agree on is not having the federal government interfere in policy issues that are in the provincial jurisdiction, and to use that as a potential wedge.
Right. I'll just finish up quickly on the economy. You were showing our fascinating consumer confidence index, and I'll ask you the question that we're asking all our panelists based on the consumer data. What's the likelihood of a recession in Canada in the next 12 months? Well, it's not necessarily in your wheelhouse, but
no. Well, it is. Yeah. Well,
it is in the confidence side.
Yeah. Well, from a confidence perspective, what it suggests is we will sputter in neutral, kind of like at that 50-point mark, where it's neither a full-on recession or anything. And I think a lot of this has to do, and we know from our polling, Canadians are very sensitive to any changes in the Canada-U.S. relationship. Like, they're not experts in stuff, but they know that if there's a problem with the relationship, that's fundamentally bad for Canada. And to the point heard earlier, we are very susceptible. The consumer confidence is very susceptible to outside shocks, and consumer behavior in terms of spending is susceptible to outside shocks.
Thanks very much, Nik. We'll leave it there. Some fascinating insight, exclusive, by the way. Never before reported until today in this room. So thanks very much. Stay tuned for a crazy night, I think, on Monday. We'll see what comes of it. In the meantime, we've given you a lot to digest over the last hour and a half, so we're going to give you a quick break, about 20 minutes, stretch your legs, have a coffee, network, and we'll see you back here at 10:55 sharp, 10:55. We'll see you then.